Hi everyone, so this month we're going to be looking at knots, and I've got a selection of knots for us to learn that we can use in our work to add some texture and a little bit of a three-dimensional effect, and also they're quite useful for adding things like eyes or flower centres. There's lots and lots of different ways that we can use our knots. I'm going to get started straight away with probably the most basic of knots, and that is the French knot. So I'm just going to demonstrate one quickly, and then we'll talk about ways to make sure we get a really good finish with our knots. So a French knot is basically made by wrapping our thread around our needle and then taking the needle back through the fabric and pulling through, and you get this really sort of neat little twist knot, almost like a hair bun in miniature. And they are fairly straightforward once you know how, but there are quite a lot of pitfalls with this that we need to avoid. So I'm going to try and show you the way to get the best effect with your knot. So I'm going to bring my thread up through the fabric, and what I want to do is keep tension on this working thread the whole time, and that's really important. So I'm just going to pull it towards me, lift it up a little bit from the fabric and just keep it under tension. And then I'm going to put my needle horizontally and just rest it on the thread there. And then I'm going to wrap twice. And so what I should be able to do is move my needle up and down my thread without the thread losing any of that tension. So I don't want to pull it so tight that I can't move my needle, and I don't want to hold it loose so that the thread sort of buckles and gathers up. I just want to keep it under tension. Now I'm going to keep hold of this thread here in my left hand, and I'm going to put the point of my needle very close to where my thread comes out of the fabric. So I'm not going to put it in exactly the same place, because if I do that, my knot will just pull through to the back. So we want a couple of threads of the weave of the fabric between where the needle came out and where it's going to go back in. And then I'm going to pull my needle up vertically and just pull on this working thread so that the twists around the needle fall back down and sit on the surface of the fabric. And then I'm going to pull my needle through. Now I'm not going to let go of this working thread. I'm going to keep it taut, and I'm just going to gently pull my thread all the way through to the back. And once you've got it going, you can let go, and that knot will just form quite neatly on the surface of the fabric there. So let's just do that again. So I'm bringing my thread through, I'm pulling it taut, and then I'm going to wrap the thread around my needle twice, put my point of my needle close to where the thread came out, and pull on the working thread so that the twists sit on the surface of the fabric. Then I'm going to take my needle upright and pull it through, holding on to my working thread, and then let it go, and that forms my knot. Okay, so we'll just do one more, and then we'll look at ways we can add variety. Okay, so needle through, thread taut, wrap twice, point of the needle close to where the thread came out of the fabric, pull on the working thread so that the twists sit on the surface of the fabric, needle upright, pull through, and that forms the knot. Okay, so that's your basic French knot. Now there are lots of different ways that you can play with a French knot, and obviously the number of twists that you add is going to change the size of the knot. So if I just do one twist, you'll see that the French knot that I get is slightly smaller than those with two twists. If I go more than two twists, your French knot is going to lose a bit of definition. So I've wrapped it 4 times there. And if you think about the way this knot is structured, we've got twists there that are held in place by this loop that I've created from my working thread, and there's only ever going to be one loop holding your twists in place. So if you do more twists, you're going to end up with a looser knot. Now, if you want a really tight dot, like for an eye or something like that, you are going to want it to be really tight, but actually you can play around with the looseness of the wraps in your knot to create some quite nice effects. So again, let me try 6 wraps. And that's going to be almost like a cone, because we've got all those wraps being held in place by just one loop. So do feel free to play around. So what can go wrong? Let me show you some accidents. So if I don't tighten my thread and I hold it, I let it sit loose, I'm going to get a loop. That's what happens. And again, you can do that deliberately. That can look quite nice as a texture in your work. So that's what happens if you don't pull your thread tight. So let me just do that again. So I'm not tightening my thread here, I'm just letting it sit loose, and I've got that sort of loop. Another thing that can go wrong is if you go through the same hole where your thread came up, your knot is going to pull through to the back and disappear. So it's really important that you add a little bit of space between where the thread comes up and where it goes back down. Another thing that can go wrong is if you don't pull the twists around your needle back down to the fabric before you pull it through, you're going to end up again with a knot that doesn't sit quite right on the surface. So they're just some things to watch out for. But once you've practiced a couple of times and done the steps that I've talked about, you should be able to get really consistent, really neat knots all the time. So that's the French knot. Our second knot is called the Colonial Knot. It's got an extra step to a French knot, but I think it's a more consistent knot and it gives you a much better finish. So the knot begins in exactly the same way. So I've brought my thread through and I'm going to hold it under tension here. And we are going to twist our thread around the needle, but we're going to add in a step first. And what we're going to do is scoop the thread. So I've got my working thread here pulled taut, and what I'm going to do is take my needle to the left of the thread and I'm just going to scoop my thread up. So from the left I'm going to scoop to the right, and then I'm going to wrap my thread over the top. So this is sometimes called the figure 8 knot as well, because we're making a sort of figure 8 with our thread. So I've taken my needle back through the fabric just like we did with our French knot, and when I pull that tight we're going to have something that's a little bit more like, it's almost like a pastry twist. I think this is an easier knot to get a really good finish with, but you'll have to play around and see what you think. So again, I've brought my thread through, I'm going to scoop the thread from left to right. You can use your finger to hold that scooped thread in place. I'm going to take my thread over the top of my needle, point through the fabric, let my twists go down to the surface of the fabric, and then pull through. So let's do that a couple more times. So I'm bringing my thread through the fabric, I'm going to scoop from left to right, and then I'm going to take my thread over the top of the needle. So hope you can see there's a little figure of 8 that I've created around my needle. So point back through the surface of the fabric, twist down to the fabric, and then pull my thread through. Okay, a couple more times. So scoop, thread over the top, point through the fabric, twist down to the surface, and then pull through. One more time. Scoop, thread over the needle, point of the needle through the fabric, pull on your working thread, and through we go. So that's our colonial knot. Another thing we can do with our knots is add an extra step again. So we've added a twist here. We're going to go back to the technique for the French knot, but this time we're going to create something called a pistil stitch, and it's called that because it's like a pistil in a flower, those little stalks that you get with a sort of pollen ball on the end, and that's what it's going to look like. So we're going to form a French knot just like we started off doing. So I've got my thread taut, I'm going to wrap twice and keep that thread under tension again. But this time, instead of going back through straight away, very close to where I came out, this time I'm going to move my needle away. And so what I'm going to add in here is a straight stitch. So I'm going to take my working thread off to the side to 9 o'clock, take my needle vertically, and keeping tension on that working thread, I'm going to pull it through there. And now we've got a little French knot on the end of a stalk, and that's called a pistil stitch. And you can play around with these. You can make the stalks really long, or you can make them shorter. You can take them off at angles. So they're quite cute little stitches to add a little bit of interest. They make quite good sort of flower buds as well. So let me just demonstrate that slowly again. So I've brought my thread up through my fabric. I'm going to start as though I'm making a French knot. So I've added 2 twists and I'm keeping that thread under tension. And then rather than going through where I came out, I'm taking my needle point a little bit away from where that thread came through, and I'm going to take it back through the fabric a little distance away, and that's a pistil stitch. Now we're going to do the dreaded bullion knot, so brace yourself. I've changed my needle, so I've been using a standard embroidery needle. These are the needles that come in all of our kits. As a general rule, the thicker the thread you use, the thicker the needle you should use. So you can see my thread and my needle are quite similar in thickness there. Now for a bullion knot, you want a different kind of needle, and what I've got here is a straw needle or a milliner's needle. And the good thing about these is that the eye is the same thickness as the shaft of the needle, and this means that because we're going to wrap our thread around our needle quite a lot, the needle can pass through those wraps with a lot more ease. Another thing worth saying about needle sizes, these are Gold Eye Milliner's needles by Clover. I just got this from my local haberdashery shop. You can see here that there are needle size numbers. So this needle that I'm using is a size 3, and basically the higher the number, the finer the needle. So this is a size 9 needle, and this is a size 3. Now it's the same with thread as well. So if you're buying pearl cottons, a size 5 thread is much thicker than a size 12 thread. Okay, so the dreaded bullion. I love these, so please give them a go. Practice really does make perfect. A couple of steps with this stitch. So we're going to bring our thread through the surface of our fabric, and then we're going to think about how long a bullion knot we want. So I'm going to do this one fairly short. So this knot is going to be maybe about 1 centimetre long. All right, now I don't just take it back through. What I'm going to do is bring the tip of my needle up where it first came out of the fabric. So let's do that again. We've brought our thread through. I'm taking it back in as far away from the working thread as I want my stitch to be, and then I'm going to bring the tip of my needle back up where my thread came out. Okay, and I'm going to push it through and just leave it there. And so what I've got here is a loop of working thread. Now I'm right-handed, so I'm going to do this with my right hand. My left hand is underneath the fabric, and I'm just going to tip the needle ever so slightly so that there's some space there, there's a gap under the needle. Because what we're going to do is wrap this needle a lot of times, and we want as many wraps as it takes to make up that space. So I've got about a centimetre long stitch length here, so I want about a centimetre of wraps on my needle. So I'm just literally taking the thread under the needle, keeping it pointing up so that there's some space to get the thread under, and I'm going to keep wrapping until I've got about a centimetre on there. So that might be a little bit too much, but never mind. Okay, so we've got our threads wrapped, and I'm keeping that under tension. So my wraps are tight around the needle, not so tight that I can't move the needle, because we're going to pull this needle through now. So we just want them just comfortably sitting on the needle next to each other, so there's not a lot of looseness and space. Now I've brought my left hand back up to the surface, and I'm just tucking it under the needle there where the thread is, and just supporting the thread. And with my right hand, or my dominant hand, I'm going to pull the needle through. Now if it won't come easily, what you can do is just twist with your thumb and forefinger there, just to loosen and then retighten the threads. And I'm going really slowly, so there's no rush with this stitch. In fact, the slower you take it, the better the finish will be. And you notice that as I'm pulling my thread, I'm still holding those wraps in place until the very last minute. And as I pull, the wraps will naturally want to tip back on themselves, back over that space that we left. And I'm just going to let them do that. And I'm just going to use my thumbnail and a little bit of twisting again to make sure those wraps sit really nicely. That's our space there. And all I do now is just take my needle back through the fabric at the end of that knot and pull it through. Okay, and that's our bullion knot. Now you can see I had slightly too many wraps on there, maybe 2 or 3 too many, and so it's sitting up a little bit like a bridge. So let's do one that sits flat. So let's do it all again. So I'm bringing my needle through, pulling my thread all the way through. I'm leaving a little space and taking my needle back through, and then bringing the point of the needle out where the thread is. Okay, and left hand underneath, or right hand if you're left-handed, just to tilt my needle up. And then I'm going to add some wraps. I'm just wrapping my thread around the needle enough times that I create the length of the stitch that I need. Then I've got my left hand underneath those wraps, and with my right hand I'm going to pull on my needle, and I'm going to just work those stitches until the needle can come through comfortably, and then I pull all the thread through. The wraps fold back on themselves, sit flat on the fabric, and I take my needle back through, and that time we got it right, and the knot is just sitting neatly on the surface. Now I'm just going to do one more just normally so that you can see it for a third time. So thread through, stitch length away, and the tip of the needle back up where the thread is. Support my needle so that it tilts up. and then I'm going to twist my threads backwards and forwards a little bit until the needle comes all the way through, twist, fold back on themselves, sit on the fabric, and we take our needle back through. That's our bullion knot. Now I'm just going to do one that's quite playful. This time I'm going to leave hardly any space at all between the thread and where I'm taking my needle back through. So I'm making that space really small, but I'm going to still add plenty of twists. Okay. Right, so I've got a really short stitch length, but quite a long line of twists there. So same process, I'm just going to bring my needle all the way through. Oh, my thread end is just a little bit caught there. And I'm going to keep pulling and take my needle back through. And because my stitch length is small, but I've got quite a number of twists on there, now I've got a little loop that sits up, and you can use this deliberately to make a loop, but you can also use a little anchor stitch to hold that down on the surface of your fabric, and if you just manipulate your twists and get that anchor stitch in between a couple of them, it's virtually invisible. So you can hold it down like that, or you can let it stand up. So you can do little arrangements. Let's show you where you can interlock these bullion knots. You've just got to be careful when your needle's coming through that you don't catch your bullion knot. Okay, so I'm just going to pull that through. So I've got that bullion knot starting in the loop of the first bullion knot, and I'm just going to take it through there. And so what I've started to do there is make a little bit of a chain. I've looped those two together, and you can play around with them like that. You can create lots of really nice, interesting textures. So what have we done? We've got our French knot, which is our most basic knot, and we looked at what happens if you wrap more times, and then we played around with the tension on the thread, and this is what happens when you leave that tension loose. Then we looked at colonial knots, and that was where we added in that little scoop on the thread. Then we looked at pistil stitches, and then finally we looked at bullion knots and looked at ways to play around with bullion knots. So these are the stitches we're going to be having a play with this month. So have a practice of those, and I will see you on Sunday with our first April video. Bye.